planning at its most general concept is something that we all do sort of intrinsically whenever we're trying to prepare for our work week or we're trying to plan a family vacation. There are a number of things that we go through sort of mentally. We don't necessarily even share those things with each other, but we have to think broadly about the preparatory steps that we're going to go through to make those activities happen in our lives. If I wanted to host a webinar, there's a certain number of things that I have to think through and take action on so that activity actually comes to fruition and you guys can log in and I can talk into my little camera here and we can connect. But by the nature of community planning, if we broaden out that concept, we have to work together. We have to get those ideas out of our individual heads and make them more explicit. We have to sit down together and think about how we're going to accomplish these things, not as individuals, but collectively. And so a lot of what happens with respect to community planning, especially on the educational side, is trying to help people understand how we all kind of come together as citizens and residents of Virginia and as Americans to make that planning process happen in a way that's hopefully free of a lot of conflict, but one that's rich with discussion, sharing ideas about what can happen across different interest groups perhaps, but certainly making sure that everybody's at least had a chance to share what's in their own head about where we want to go into the future. And really that's where all planning activities really start, is thinking about where we're at now, the reality that we're faced with, and thinking through the considerations of change. We're all going to be in a world where change happens to us. We don't get to necessarily get to choose what changes and when it changes. We have to react to things. We know what we want to accomplish perhaps, but we're not necessarily going to get there if we don't think through and anticipate what might happen between today and that anticipated future condition. So planning has everything to do with that gap between today's reality and where we'd like to go. Not necessarily even very specific, but just generally knowing that tomorrow is going to be different today, and we're going to need to prepare for whatever that condition might be tomorrow. So planning is about that gap. Planning in this country specifically is also about self-determination. There's something incredibly rich and deeply valuable to the planning process from an American standpoint. We certainly didn't invent the idea of planning, but we did really kind of institutionalize the idea of self-determination. And so there's something very American about the exercise of planning. And I don't suggest that as a really patriotic term, but there's a great opportunity for people who want to engage in government and want to engage in economic development, both from the private side but also the public side, to get engaged and work with other people to make the future that they have in their own heads. So we want to encourage people to engage in that self-determination exercise. Lastly, planning really becomes, especially at the community level, an activity of getting ideas on the page, organizing them in a series of preparatory steps, making sure that priorities are identified, and then marching through all of those steps to be able to get to where we want to go. And it's really that organizing activity of planning that makes community planning feel like a technical exercise, but really it's about people coming together. So we want to make sure that people understand planning is a personal activity, but it's a way for us to come together, define some community goals, and determine our own future rather than just letting that happen to us. So at the very heart of the planning exercise are people. We have lots of different types of people that come together in planning exercise, lots of different interests that need to be served by the planning exercise. So there's going to be some divergence in what people want from their communities and how they see that being served. So we need to be able to work with one another and reconcile, all of those different things that come together in the planning exercise. So at its heart, planning is a person-oriented activity, but we also have to work within the constraints of the law. Not necessarily constraints, maybe that's not the right word, but certainly there are boundaries. It's not just a free-flowing discussion, but there are things that we're enabled to do and that help us construct the planning exercise. So we need to understand those things. We also need to appreciate the fact that getting things out of our minds and onto the page, making them explicit, requires that we write them down, draw pictures, all of those very human activities that we do. And so there's some products to planning that we need to understand and appreciate. And then lastly, taking up the exercise of planning means that there are some tools to help us be productive in that exercise. So as I said, all the people that come together in this planning activity are incredibly diverse. First of all, you have the state and federal government that are going to be a part of this exercise, but you at the local governmental level, hopefully there are some planning commissioners that are on the webinar today, maybe some elected officials even, or if you're even considering being a planning commissioner, you're going to be engaging in a government exercise. For better or worse, that's sort of how things are constructed within the law. So planning is going to be a local governmental activity. The Planning Commission itself leads the way on some of those planning activities, but certainly the public is going to be engaging with you in that exercise, as well as the governing body and a number of other staff positions. So we want to make sure that we understand each of those actors in the system and how their roles differ and how they kind of come together and intersect each other. And I need to make a clarification. When I say the public on this presentation, that means the public from a lot of different perspectives. We mean that there will be the general public, everybody who lives within a community, but we also mean that there are applicants that are applying for a development proposal. And we also mean that there are public interests that will be coming to the table. So we fully appreciate the fact that there are environmental groups that are interested in developing a bright future for education. Maybe there's economic development groups, like Chamber of Commerce, that want to participate in the planning process. And so all of those groups sort of comprise the interests of the community, not just individuals and not just people seeking to develop a property, but all of these folks coming together to compose the community. And all of that gets embodied in this whole planning and zoning law concept. There's, again, federal and state governments coming into the mix. We also have the local government playing a role. There are a number of ways that the law actually comes into being that affect the planning exercise. It's not just a matter of the laws on the books, as it were, but there's some other documents and other processes that kind of come into this. So we need to be aware of them and understand that there's a lot of different things to pay attention to. There are some folks in your local government that can help you understand these, where law comes from and how it's constructed. We appreciate the fact that sometimes education in a formal setting is useful too, so look for the land use education program to provide as much education as you all want us to. But anyway, going back to the presentation, from the federal and state perspective, you have constitutional issues that come into the planning exercise. We'll talk about those in just a moment. But we also have legislative acts, both from the Congress at the federal level and the General Assembly at the state level. There are administrative rules that guide how the government needs to conduct its business, from state agencies being told what the law is nice, but there are also some administrative rules that dictate how that work is to be accomplished. And so there'll need to be some understanding of those administrative rules to really understand how planning ultimately gets done. And lastly, there are judicial rulings or case law that comes out of cases being brought either against the government or against an applicant that require a judge to make a determination where the law itself is maybe a little fuzzy or gray. And those judicial rulings serve as precedent that guide future decisions or future possible cases that guide how laws may be constructed at the congressional or General Assembly levels over time. So all of those things certainly need to be paid attention to. There are, of course, lots of things that happen in local government which guide case law and guide the construction of legislative acts. Certain powers are enabled for you all at the local level that are worth paying attention to, and we'll get into just a few of those during the course of this presentation. Looking broadly at the constitutional issues, there are some 4 or so amendments to the Constitution which really kind of serve as the core, the backbone of where planning and zoning law comes from. I won't go into too much depth in this presentation, but it can get fairly involved. There's a lot of discussion that goes on in this, but as far as being able to establish the force of law and the administrative capabilities of government, this is sort of where everything starts from. The First Amendment really has the power within it to force the federal and state government, even the local government, to hear the people. If you have a problem with how business gets done in your government, then you have the right under the federal Constitution to petition your government to be heard, and the First Amendment makes that inalienable. The 5th and 14th Amendments really go into procedural and substantive due process. So what does the government have to do to protect that petitioning to make sure that people are heard? Procedural due process has to do with providing public notice, letting people know that there's an opportunity for them to be heard, and making sure that's a fair and open and transparent process is something that we all strive for, and I think people generally do a pretty good job of that. But there are some construction of that in the Code of Virginia of how that's to be done at the bare minimum to make sure people are being to make sure that these amendments are constructed correctly, if you want to think about it that way, at the state level. And then we also have substantive due process, which has to do with making sure that the health, safety, and welfare of the citizenry are being protected, and that the laws being constructed have those 3 objectives in mind when they're developed, and also protects private property owners from taking. So we want to make sure that private property law is, above all else, abided by. We want to make sure that we understand what and when a government is allowed to exercise its eminent domain capabilities and when that's inappropriate. So knowing that the federal Constitution protects those things is an important characteristic of how the law has been constructed. And then the last amendment that gets talked about is the 10th Amendment, which provides for police bringing in the police powers of the federal government and state government to make sure that zoning specifically is seen as something that's a legitimate exercise that can be done by government, and this is sort of embedding that in the federal framework. I won't pay any attention to this collaborative federalism statement, but that is an issue that's becoming more and more important over time. From the state perspective, moving beyond the sort of federal Constitution, you also have the states taking their authority from the federal government and making that authority real in the state of Virginia and every other state. Now, we have in Virginia a Dillon rule state. There are sort of 2 ideas about where or how the power of the state gets enacted at the local level. We have a Dillon rule state. Other states are home rule. The difference between the 2 is that in Dillon rule states, that's sort of a list of things that local governments are allowed to do. The powers that local governments have are enumerated by the state, whereas in the home rule state, you have sort of the opposite. You're allowed to do anything you want to do at the local level except the following prohibited activities. And really, there's not too much difference between living in a home rule state or a Dillon rule state in terms of how local governments can actually exercise the planning activity, especially knowing that so many activities are permissible in Virginia. We really do have a fair amount of flexibility in how we exercise the planning activity. So I don't want folks to get hung up on this idea of Dillon's rule. If you've heard of that, it's sometimes talked about as a tight constriction on how local governments are allowed to behave. And that is true to a certain degree, but it's not a terrible burden on local governments being able to do the real heart and soul of the planning activity. Most of what happens within Virginia Code has to do with what's allowed, and sometimes that's mandated activities, like every locality must have a planning commission or must have a comprehensive plan. But oftentimes, the Code of Virginia is much less dictatorial in a way. It's more discretionary in saying things such as localities are allowed to have a zoning ordinance. And it's really enabling the locality to make that determination as to whether or not they want to have a zoning ordinance, except for those areas which have some exceptions to that rule. So if you live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, there's a requirement that you do have zoning at the local level. So you really need to pay close attention to what the Code of Virginia is telling you to be able to engage in that the planning exercise in your locality. What are you supposed to be doing in your locality? Letting that be a local process. I talked about the Dillon rule, so I won't go too far down that discussion, but really the Code of Virginia talks about powers that are expressly or fairly implied that local governments can engage in. If it's not there, if you don't see that power in the Code of Virginia, somebody brings a suit and sues the local government, the judge is going to make a determination as to whether or not local government is enabled to do that activity or to do that activity in the way that it's been done, perhaps. If the judge rules, it's going to, and there's a gray area, it's not clear as to whether or not the locality has that power, then the locality is presumed not to have that authority in the cases as ruled in the other direction. So be aware of that as you engage in the activity of developing policy at the local level. For anybody who really wants to dig into this stuff, I'd encourage you to read the Code of Virginia, specifically Title 15.2, Chapter 22. That's going to have 70 or 80% of the Virginia statutes that have some relevance back to planning and zoning. So I've provided you a link here in the presentation, which you're welcome to go to. It's a great resource, and you can search through that section of the code and find things that are relevant for you. Now, once you've kind of understood how people are engaging in the planning exercise and the sort of the fabric of the law and how that characterizes the planning activity at the local level, it's important to understand there's multiple products that really come out of the planning exercise. It's not just simply creating a comprehensive or master plan and saying this is our vision of where we want to go as a community into the future, but really you have to think about that planning exercise as a documentation process. And then there's multiple ways to document greater and greater detail about what you mean by this vision and how you construct that at the local level to make it real. So here's a set of planning products that you can look for in your community. One way to talk about those things is that they're sort of a set of Russian nesting dolls, that at the largest level, that biggest doll, if you will, you have the comprehensive plan laying out general areas that you want specific activities in. So you might show on a map or in a document that we want our sort of rural lands to be mostly agriculture. We don't want to have little businesses scattered through there, but we want to preserve those large acreages for just agricultural activity or something like that. And then might have a more urbanized area that really characterizes where you'd like to see some development. But to really put teeth into that framework or that visionary document, you need to dig down into some of these other planning products. So every government can have subdivision ordinance, a zoning ordinance. You may have a capital improvement plan that you need to pay attention to that has something to do with how you finance the future and actually looking out over the 5 or 10 year horizon to thinking about things like schools, firehouses, and those kinds of activities where you need a large capital infusion, lots of money that needs to be involved, and it goes beyond that sort of 1 year budgetary process. So that's it's a good document to pay attention to and understand how that comprehensive plan has found its way into the capital improvements plan. And then lastly, at the very smallest scale, sort of that smallest Russian nesting doll there in the middle, we have the site plan and building code approval process. And I like this idea very much of being able to say, here's where we want to go, here's the idea of our comprehensive plan, and then linking all of those documents through the subdivision ordinance and the zoning ordinance all the way down to that site scale, not for the sake of constricting what you want, but for enumerating those things which are desirable or you feel are purposeful in creating that vision. So there's always going to be a human activity, a give and take, in how the plan comes to fruition. And that's really the responsibility of the Planning Commission, zoning administrator, the elected body, getting together and sort of allowing development to happen at its own pace, but providing the guidance for developers and for business owners to understand how it is that you'd like that future to develop so they can try to meet you in that place. So let's pay very close attention to the comprehensive plan, and then we'll move on to the discussion. The comprehensive plan is something that really is the sort of backbone document that empowers the rest of those Russian nesting dolls to kind of come into reality. So it's important to understand its development process. In the Code of Virginia, the comprehensive plan is really talking about a harmonious development of territory, which will be in accordance with the present and the probable future needs and resources within the community. And it's looking at the attributes of the community that have something to do with promoting health, safety, moral standards, order, convenience, prosperity, general welfare of the inhabitants of that community. So some of those things are enumerated there in the Code of Virginia, which are fairly spectacular if you sort of think about what we're trying to accomplish with the planning exercise. It's pretty daunting, and there's a lot of discussion that can come into how best to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of all the citizens or all the residents of the community. So it's something that I think is important and try to take seriously and spend a good amount of energy on, lest it becomes stale and fail at its mission. So a lot of people concern themselves pretty deeply with this document. But at the end of the day, the plan is a guide, and you really do need to look at tools of planning like zoning to sort of put teeth to that vision and show people here are the hard boundaries of where we expect certain activities to occur, and hopefully there's some agreement. Now, the planning process itself is really cyclical in nature. So you're not just engaging in the planning exercise once and you're done. You're not laying out one vision, but you're trying to amend that vision over time, and we'll talk just briefly about that. But the planning process itself begins with understanding that you are not alone in the process. The comprehensive planning process begins with the Planning Commission or with the elected officials saying it's time for us to update our comprehensive plan. But even before you start that process, there needs to be some agreement about what's the scope of our planning exercise. How much budget are we going to allocate to making that planning exercise happen? And are we all on the same page with regard to the timeline? What type of document are we trying to generate? How are the public going to be brought into the process? All those things being thought through on the beginning or the front end of a project like this makes it possible for people to kind of have a shared understanding of where we're going and what we'd like to create as a matter of planning. That's where we sort of begin thinking about the comprehensive planning process. And once everybody's brought into that and has an agreement about it, we can say that we've prepared ourselves for the planning exercise. The next thing you'll be doing in terms of comprehensive planning is analyzing where we're at right now as a community. So the Planning Commission, as dictated by what the Code of Virginia says that you can or should be doing, really starts with an analysis of the community. So how do you think about how is our population going to change over time? Are we getting older? Are there people from different demographics moving in or moving out of our community? What does that mean for the economic development opportunities and how we've structured our programming to support schools or economic development programs, incentivizing certain types of businesses, et cetera. So all of that analysis really needs to be done on the front end to determine whether or not the current state of affairs is appropriate for what you expect to have happen in the future. And if it's not, maybe that becomes a goal within the comprehensive planning process, is to understand that we're not going to have enough capacity in our schools, so let's plan for the development of some newer schools. That's something that you can kind of say we'd like to have a world-class educational system, and to be able to get there, we need to set that goal for ourselves. So the analysis is absolutely critical. Pretty consistent to flow from that analysis to understanding that there's important points that have kind of come out of that conversation about how things are going or where are we at. Those become the goals that you set for yourself. And then we move into actually saying, well, if we want a world-class education system and we know we need to grow our educational capacity, how are we going to do that? And the next part of the comprehensive planning process is actually laying out some strategies for yourself, and not just laying them out in terms of aspiration, but actually trying to say, how much time do we need to accomplish that strategy? Who needs to be involved? Who's got the authority to make that a reality? And when should we expect to participate in that exercise? So developing those action plans becomes a critical piece of the comprehensive planning process and making that vision a reality. Moving from there, we actually have both in terms of due process, but also just being a good local government. We want to make sure there's ample opportunity to review the plan that the Planning Commission has come up with, that the public has hopefully provided some input on, making sure that we've gone through the public hearing process as we should in terms of due process, and getting the approval of the elected body. Once it's gotten to that, well, not just the elected body, I should say, but also state agencies that need to be involved, such as VDOT or the Department of Transportation. Once all of those approvals have been aggregated and everybody's on board and we've got an approval vote from the local elected body, then we could actually move into the implementation of the comprehensive plan and seeing all those great goals and strategies being taken up by the Planning Commission, by staff, by developers walking in the door. So all of those implementation strategies start to come to fruition. One thing that we try to emphasize nowadays that maybe wasn't so much stressed in earlier times is the idea of tracking performance. We really want to see folks talking about how do they know that their strategy was successful or wasn't successful in that case, in some cases, so that you can begin again to understand why are we facing the challenges that we are in our community. We tried to do something and maybe it didn't benefit our community in the way that we thought that it would. What can we do differently next time we go through that comprehensive planning process that might lead us to a different solution or might lead us to a different management strategy? Letting the public come to their own understanding of how it's going by tracking those performance metrics helps everybody who's engaging you or engaging the local government in the planning process know that their voice has been valued, be able to have full transparency on how the government is actually engaging in that process. And it also helps the public value what it is that you've created. So if you've improved the school system, if you've improved economic development opportunities for businesses in your area, tracking the performance, understanding how those businesses came to be, and communicating that back out to the public is a great way for them to value the whole exercise of planning and hopefully participate within the next cycle of planning as you go forward. I won't go into zoning within this presentation, but suffice to say that it's a tool. It's not the only tool available for local governments. But zoning, its job is to sort of put teeth to the comprehensive plan. And so thinking of the zoning tool from that perspective linking the comprehensive plan to the zoning ordinance, making sure that the two documents are in correspondence, so what you see in terms of a vision is actually put into that zoning document, actually is very helpful in making sure that the types of development that you expect to see come to fruition. Linking that back to the health, safety, and welfare of the community through the zoning ordinances is something that's been and done for generations at this point, and we encourage you to really focus in on that zoning ordinance to see how it can be improved and brought to bear on the comprehensive planning exercise, if nothing else. With that, I'm going to stop talking at you, and hopefully this has been constructive in helping you understand the overarching concepts that come into the planning process, especially at the local governmental level. Both myself and Mike Chandler are always available to answer questions for you outside of this webinar. We have educational programs for planning commissioners and BZA members across the state. You're welcome to go to planvirginia.com and learn about what's coming up.